Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar on the what and hows of neurodiversity. And our speaker is Rachel Harris. She works as a coordinator for special educational needs in a bilingual primary school in somewhere near Geneva. I think, is that right, Rachel?
Perfect. That's right.
Yeah. And she's also an author. She has published material on inclusion and learning strategies, and she's the author of the title Activities for Developing Learning Strategies, which was published by Delta, which is part of Ernst Klett Sprachen, and there will be a link to that title later on, and also to more books that she's written, 50 Ways to Include Learners with Dyslexia, and I think it's the end of the year. We've got a new title to dealing with ADHD. Right, and as always, you'll get a certificate of attendance and a handout with all the, I don't know, are there any links in it, or the main sort of points of your talk anyway, Rachel?
It's the main point of my talk, as I will mention, my handouts and my slides, as you see, I try to walk my talk, so everything is very simple.
Great. Let's have a look at that then. And I'll hand over to you and I'll see you later.
Great. Thank you very much. So Brigitte is going to stay around, everybody. I will look at the chat and try and answer questions as we go along, but I might not see all the questions because there's a lot of you. So if you want to be sure your question isn't missed, could you send it as a private message to Brigitte Briggs? And then she can pick them up, and I will leave 5-10 minutes at the end to answer as many questions as I can. And if I can't, I'll give you my email address, and I'm always willing to chat and to talk about this subject because I think it's so important. So this is a workshop, so you will be expected to do a little bit of work, participate if you feel comfortable doing so, of course. So we're going to talk today about neurodiversity in general, and I will be coming back later in the month to talk more specifically about dyslexia. But first of all, I'd like to talk about neurodiversity, special needs, what it all means, and what overlaps we can expect. So if we move on, there we go. My first question for you is, what do you think we mean by neurodiversity? What do you know about it? Something you've heard or a question? If you could type that into the chat. I know when I'm in a workshop, I often find the chat sometimes the most interesting part. So share your ideas amongst yourselves. Spectrum, yes, Judith. Yeah. Okay. Spectrum, autism. Okay. Great. I mean, I could sit and watch this all day, but obviously we have to go on. Thank you very much. Obviously, everybody's brain is neurodiverse. That's the whole point. We all have different, all our brains are wired slightly differently and work in slightly different ways. So when we talk about neurodiversity, what we mean in general is a brain that works perhaps more differently than what we consider to be the norm, although of course there is no real norm. Okay, it's important to know that neurodiversity, as it says, is a difference in the brain, and that is already evident in a prenatal brain scan. We are all born with at least the architectural differences of our brains. And then environment can play a certain role, which we can talk about a little bit later. What does SEN and SPLD mean? Do you want to just type in the box? Do you know what the initials are? What do they mean for you, etc.? Or the difference with neurodiversity? Great, Carolina, you're going to learn something. How great. Okay, so SEN is specific educational needs. And SPLD, yes, all special, and I'll come to this in a minute. SPLD is specific or special learning difficulties. I personally prefer using differences to difficulties, but officially it's specific learning difficulties. And as people mentioned before when we were talking about neurodiversity, we tend to use neurodiversity to talk about the autism spectrum and maybe ADHD. And SEN and SPLD, which are interchangeable, they mean the same thing, are used to talk about differences such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, etc. The difference is autism and ADHD are not officially considered specific educational needs because they're not just going to change lives in an educational setting. Whereas a person with dyslexia, in the rest of their life, apart from the reading or other aspects, it's not going to be evident, whereas autism and ADHD is going to be evident in many more aspects of people's lives. And that's why they're not actually considered special educational needs. However, personally, teaching students with autism and with ADHD, they are definitely educational needs, which are specific to individual students. So I hope that's a little bit clearer about this specific vocabulary. Again, ask if you have any questions, but we're going to, first of all, look at some of the signs, the what's, etc. How would I replace differences? So SPLD is specific learning difficulties. However, I would prefer to say specific learning differences. Hope that's clear, Melina. Okay, moving on. There are 6 phrases here. Tell me just yes or no. Number 1, is this a sign of neurodiversity? Number 1, yes or no. Number 2, yes or no. Number 3, yes or no. Put your number with it, Carolina. Do you mean number 1 is not a sign of neurodiversity, you say? Okay. Is number 2 a sign of neurodiversity? Write the number, write yes or no. Okay. Okay, yes or no. Okay, so to end the suspense, yes and no. As some of you said, none of them or almost all of them. Every person with a specific learning difference will have different needs, so it's not always the case. However, one of the pre-signs of dyslexia can be fine motor difficulties. So a sign could be a younger student who cannot tie their shoelaces at an age where others can. Also, young learners or even babies who don't tend to be able to follow along with nursery rhymes and learning things by heart. Microsoft and many other companies have specific programs targeting neurodiverse people, including autism and ADHD, because of their specific problem-solving skills and the way they think out of their box. So statistically, people who work for Microsoft have a higher chance of being neurodiverse than in other areas of the working world. Listening comprehension, yes, even with students who have difficulty reading and writing. We'll have a look at this. Number 4, yes, because organizational skills are an important executive function that can be affected by neurodiversity. And this, again, it's hard for teachers to remember. Often we try to do our best. We all try to do our best. And so we're busy thinking, okay, this student, I know this student has dyslexia. I know it's going to be complicated for this student to do this reading comprehension. And we forget that the fact that they may get the classroom wrong, they may come without their material, and this kind of thing. Organizational skills is also part of their learning difference. Number 6, statistically as well, many teachers, people with ADHD, there are certain jobs that people with ADHD statistically have more chance of doing. And one of those jobs is teacher, or language teacher in this case. So this may be you, this may be somebody in your staff room, but one of the, many of the qualities that are associated with ADHD, thinking on the spot, energy, thinking outside the box, creativity, will be useful aptitudes for a language teacher. And the only one of these that has no link at all with neurodiversity or specific needs is number 5, Judith, and that's why I came to it last. There is no research, no evidence that being left-handed is linked to any learning difficulty at all. There you go. So, the definitions. There are other learning differences as well, but these are the main ones. It's also important to note that there's a lot of overlap, which is officially called comorbidity, but I think that's pretty morbid, actually, funnily enough. So many of these are linked together. A person with ADHD or a person with dyslexia has about 50% chance of also having ADHD, for example. Okay, so I am going to read the definition and you are going to write the learning difference in the chat box. First definition: difficulties with working memory, with planning and prioritization, with time management, with flexibility, with stress, and self-worth. Okay. Second definition: difficulty with working memory, planning, time management, flexibility, stress, and self-worth. Third definition: difficulty with working memory, with planning, with time management, with flexibility, with stress, with self-worth. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to go through them all because you can know what's going to happen, etc. But this is just to say that these executive functions, and we're going to look at the executive functions afterwards, but these executive functions and the difficulties with them are going to show up in every neurodiverse, or in many neurodiverse situations. Obviously, everybody is different. Okay, so although you may associate them with ADHD, that doesn't mean that a person with dyslexia or dyspraxia will not be affected by time management or organization skills. So that's quite clear. Executive functions are affected in many specific learning difficulties. Back to our traditional definitions then. Which of these is associated with a difficulty in expressive oral speech and comprehension, which may include syntax, grammar, vocabulary, and receptive listening skills? So actually in speech, we would, yes, mainly be looking at dysphasia. But you're not wrong, dyslexia is also affected. Which of these may lead to difficulties in movement? And this may include fine motor movement, which may be writing, which may be sitting up straight, getting dressed, etc. So this would be dyspraxia, that's right. Which of the following is related to a difficulty, so a hyper or hypo focus? It can be a difficulty in focusing, or it can be focusing too much. Okay, ADHD. And there's obviously a lot of other definitions and things involved with ADHD. So this is focus, it can be movement and hyperactivity, and something we often forget, which is the impulsivity. We tend to think of hyperactivity and focus, attention, but not impulsivity, which is often present. Which of these is associated with difficulty in mathematical symbols, in maths, in algebra, in more or less or differences in groups? That's dyscalculia. Yes. Okay. Which leaves us with, I think we're quite clear on, dyslexia is mainly associated with difficulties in reading and writing. But as you mentioned, which is brilliant, it can also be oral, it can be putting ideas into place in oral presentations and things like that. So remember that. And of course, ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, which again, I'm not very keen on, or autism spectrum condition, as it's also known. Okay. Just to mention on labels, labels change, obviously. I mean, if we think to many years ago, Mary Montessori, who did wonderful things for teaching students with learning difficulties, called these students retarded, which is something we would definitely never use now. So maybe the terms we're using now will seem very inappropriate in the future. And just a couple of things to say, which is I prefer a person first identification. So talking about a person with dyslexia, for example, as opposed to a diagnosis first, which would be a dyslexic. So I'm more comfortable saying that. Concerning autism, I would say a person with autism, but as you may well be aware, there's quite a lot of autsy pride movements, etc., neurodiversity pride movements, where people with neurodiversity are reclaiming their own words, and some of them want to be called autistic, etc. And obviously that's an individual choice and up to the person. So when you are talking with a person, exactly, yes. And because it's, yes, I quite agree, Varvara. It's like I am English. It's not the only thing I am, but it's part of my personality. It's part of etc. So even if it's not the be all and the end all, etc. So if I were you, I would ask these people how they would like you to, what language would you be comfortable with me using? And again, many of these things, it's indirect. You don't really talk to I don't talk to a person. Well, maybe I do actually with dyslexia. I talk about their dyslexia, but I don't identify them when talking necessarily about it. So, as we've said, all these learning differences are so much more about that, more than that. They are also, and I think this is what's useful for us as English or as language teachers, and this is what I want to look at today, is how the executive functions, so these executive functions can all be affected, and you will not necessarily be aware of this, and your students might not either. I've had students with dyslexia that when I have said, don't worry, I understand that you may find organizing your notes for an oral speech difficult, they didn't realize that it was necessarily part of their dyslexia. So it's not unusual not to be aware of all these differences. But when we look at them, we can see how much they can play out in the classroom. So I'd just like you to think about a lesson you've taught this week or recently, and how working memory was necessary for one of these tasks. So I will give you an example. Just this week, to revise classroom objects, we played a game. I played a game with a class of 7-year-olds. It's called Kim's Game. So I took a variety of their objects, a pen, some glue, a rubber, and I put them on a tray, and then I put a piece of paper over them and asked them to write down or call out what was on my tray. Now, obviously, for me, this was to revise the vocabulary. However, can you see that for a student with difficulties with their working memory, then that would be a challenge in the classroom. So have a think, and if you want to type in some of the activities you've done this week that have used working memory. Yeah, so with I Spy, I'm assuming that's remembering what the other students said, the other answers that were there. Yep, being back in class. Yes, Judith. So a lot of reading comprehension and listening comprehension especially is working on working memory, holding in your head a piece of information for a few minutes, whether it's one of the questions, then looking where the answer is, or whether it's trying to remember part of the text and then remembering the answer to the questions, etc. Okay. Yeah. I mean, working memory is such an important part of learning a language. As you're probably aware, everything goes into our working memory, and then it's placed in our long-term memory. And And so if we have difficulties with that, it's going to make language learning difficult. Focus, of course, we expect our students to focus on the task they are doing. So a word about ADHD, because I think that's what we think of when we think of focus, is to remember that this can be difficulty in focusing, but ADHD is very badly named, in my opinion, because it is not attention deficiency. It's not a deficiency of focus or attention. It is a difficulty. We all have two different kinds of attention or focus. We have the, I am working really hard on this exercise and focusing on that. And that's what we think about when we talk about attention and focus. But we also have wide range attention. So think of it as a light. You could have a torch spotlight on this text to concentrate on it, or you could have a wide open ambient light like the one on my ceiling, which is going to light up all the room. My attention is the same. And we all have this. We have the attention. So our wide attention is when we're daydreaming. I was in the train earlier, looking out the window, seeing various things, etc., things coming through my brain, etc. Or I could have been focusing on reading a book. And for our students with ADHD, it's hard to flit from one kind of focus to the other. So they could be really focused on something and find it hard to come out of task and do something else. Or they could be focusing, looking at the whole picture. And this is where those qualities about thinking outside the box and problem solving come in, because they can tend to look at the whole picture, whereas we could be looking at this is the problem. They're going to pick up more ideas on how to solve it, for example. Yes, everything is a struggle, yes. And with organization, as we see. Task initiation is getting down to work. You've told your students what to do. You've given them an example. You've modeled it. And now off you go and finish the exercise. And this kind of mini procrastination can be a problem for many of our students and sometimes us. And we have to remember procrastination is when it's easier not to do the task than to do it. And it's only when it becomes uncomfortable, more uncomfortable not doing the task, that we are going to do it. So for many of us, this might be, we know we've got to fill in our tax form because it's going to be very uncomfortable paying our tax later if we don't. Okay. And in the classroom, many students have this struggle with it's a difficult exercise, I might get it wrong. A lot of our students with learning difficulties are going to have self-worth issues, as we've mentioned, just because of the tough times they've gone through in every other class. So it makes it harder to do an exercise where you know that you risk getting it wrong. It's going to be harder for you. It's more tiring. It takes more brain power. I mentioned organization. So you're going to see this, as some of you have mentioned, where are the books? Have you brought them to class, etc. Okay. We'll go on to look at some solutions. There are obviously no one thing fits all, but we'll look at some solutions. I mentioned time management. So many students, and actually I find this with young learners now, especially because they look at the time on their phone. So it is always 17:29 and not 1/2 and not 1:45 and not 20 minutes. And there's a difference because time is 60 minutes, but we often think in hundreds. So many students don't necessarily think automatically that 4:55 is nearly 5 o'clock. They think it's, there's still lots of numbers to go. And also some students with learning people with learning difficulties, neurodiverse people, live very much in the now. So now I'm not late for class, even though class is in 5 minutes and I am 30 minutes from the classroom, I'm not late now. So that can be a challenge as well. We'll look at defining goals as well. Yeah, flexibility in the way of thinking, etc. Again, it depends. It can be more or less, but routine is reassuring for all of us. In fact, many of the things that help our students who are more neurodiverse are things that help us, but maybe they need a little bit more of it. So for all of us, routine is reassuring. We like to be in our comfort zone. And perhaps when lots of things are so hard and we are out of our comfort zone so much, it's reassuring to be in our comfort zone. And that's why some of our learners will need more routine than others. Some of our students who we don't expect it will be very observant. And this is interesting because I notice in my classroom, a student with ADHD who may not be paying attention will always be the first to notice a mistake on a worksheet or something strange in the workbook or something like that. Again, it's this whole wide focus thing. It's pretty obvious that some people are going to have more stress in life. And I mentioned this impulsivity earlier, which will show up in self-restraint and also emotional control. Again, like us, if you've had a tough day, it can be hard to guard your calm and your quiet. And so some people have tougher days than others. And we need to remember that it's not just in our classroom and it's not just in a learning environment that these people face challenges. It can be reading the bus timetable. It can be getting on the wrong bus. It could be confusing left and right. It can be doing the work and then leaving it at home. So many other things that will be going on outside our classroom. Yeah, and as you say, self-regulation is a challenge as well. So what can we do? We can think about how we're going to lay out. So what we're going to look at is think about how we're going to lay out our classroom, our lessons, our lesson plans, and then I'm going to give you the essentials, or what I think certainly help. So in our classroom, think about our wall displays, because we like to decorate. We like to show the work the students have done. It's good publicity. It's motivating. It makes the classroom a friendly place. But one thing you can simply do, depending on how your students are seated, is make sure you keep your posters and things like that at the back of the class. Depending on the layout of the classroom, I know where I am, this means that the students see it when they come in before they sit down. But it means it's not around the whiteboard that I want them to be looking at. Because if I want my students to be concentrating on my whiteboard, I don't want to have loads of exciting things around it. I might have some words, important words or phrases around, but not too much in the line of vision. Some of our students, so I'm mainly thinking about students on the autism spectrum, or students with dyspraxia as well, but others as well, can be very sensitive, sensorially sensitive. So that can be to sounds, to sights, to smells, and to heating, and visually with the lighting. So make sure your students are comfortable with the lighting, with the heating. So that might be, are they going to be sitting near the radiator or not? I did read somewhere that men are more comfortable in a cooler classroom than women. So I'm not sure quite how to fix that, apart from let the girls sit next to the radiator. But make sure that the light is comfortable for everybody. That might mean having some students next to the window to make the most of daylight, etc. Ask your students if they're comfortable with it, if they want the light on or off, or if possible, ideally, is it possible to bring in a few lamps, keep them in a cupboard, and have students put lamps up around the tables as well? I realise many of us spend our days going from classroom to classroom with huge bags. Another thing is seating. So different ideas can be, so many of us may like our students seated in groups. When you do that, you need to think carefully about whether everybody can see the board clearly while and write while they're looking at the board. And actually some studies have suggested that students with ADHD, for example, might work better in rows. If your students are in rows, try and make sure that your students with learning differences, that they're easy to access, that you don't have to sort of squeeze down a row, because you may need to go and stand near them more often. Try and make sure they've got enough space, maybe a spare table next to them. And in our official recommendations, some students, it does say sit them at the front. However, if you're going to have all your students with ADHD sitting together at the front, that's not necessarily going to be useful for them or for you. So you might find that students will work better with a partner, a patient, and maybe higher level, language level partner who is happy to sit with them and to model activities, etc. for them. Use your cupboard. In my cupboard, and I'll come back to this, I have extra pens, extra books, paper, everything. I know we're trying to, especially with younger learners, it's quite easy, well, if you've not bought your book, etc. But don't forget, if a student can't remember to bring their book, that it's not a good idea to penalise them by not letting them work in class. They won't be able to work if they haven't got the material. So find a system. And for me, the easiest is to have a pencil case at the front, to have a no blame policy, and they can come and borrow things and get on with class. And again, in my classroom, I encourage students just to come forward and borrow things, take them, and put them back when they've finished. A great way of making sure everything comes back is to give it a name. I don't know if you've ever seen on internet Derek the glue, but you call your glue stick Derek, and then at the end of the lesson, where's Derek? Derek needs to come home to the desk. You have a very good chance of getting Derek back, and a much higher chance than if it's just a glue stick or a pen. Okay. Are there any questions? Let's just have a little stop and think. Are there any questions so far? Are there any comments? And are there any suggestions? Is there anything you do in your classroom that's in the layout, in just the things in the classroom? Yeah, I love the Borrow Me basket. It's also non-judgmental. We've talked about self-worth, and I think there are bigger battles to fight than, oh, you've forgotten your pen again. That nowhere in the history of pens has anybody remembered a pen by a teacher saying, oh, no, I'm not surprised you've forgotten your pen again. Okay. And yes, exactly, it's the same for adults, and maybe even more embarrassing for adults to forget. We all forget things. I do, and I model it to my students, and I'm always the first one to say, oh, I've forgotten my book. And they're like, oh, Mrs. Harris, go and get one out of the cupboard. And why not pretend to forget it occasionally? Actually, it would do them. I think self-worth and motivation are the biggest things we can give our students in the classroom. And it just keeps the atmosphere happier. We will move on, so we have time for questions at the end, if there are any. Please think of your questions, note them down, add them as we go along, as I said. When planning your lesson, I noticed when I was studying specific learning difficulties that actually a lot of the things that help our students with specific learning difficulties are things we are doing already in the ELT classroom. And one of the main ones is overlearning. It is very important. These students, as with many of our students, personally, and I think most of them, nobody learns a word like that. You need to see it again and again. We see various studies. You need to see it at least 7 times, etc. And this is a natural part of the language classroom. So bring it up more and more. That can just be simply at the beginning of the lesson. What did we look at last week? Can anybody remember, what does this word mean? We looked at a word that meant this. Can anybody think of that? In a just non-judgmental, what can you remember about last lesson? Last lesson we looked at cooking. Can you give me one word we learned? And always encourage your students to put their hands up, and perhaps avoid as well cold calling. So rather than, John, give me a word we learned last lesson, it's, can you remember anything about last lesson, or tell me what you remember. And I encourage my students, if you put your hand up when you know something, then there's less chance of me sort of asking you if you've already put your hand up 2 or 3 times, if they are comfortable doing so. Remember that some of our students would not be comfortable with you with putting their hand up. So by cold calling, cold calling is when you just ask, okay, so John, what is the answer to question 13? Now, poor John might have been really concentrated for the rest of the lesson. He may have known all the other answers except for this one, and it's the only one you're going to ask him, and you can't know that. So it's obviously going to affect John's self-esteem, and John is going to go out remembering, I didn't know the answer to question 13, and not, I knew the answer to the other 12 questions. And of course, the other thing in classroom management is if you say, John, the 19 other students are now off the hook and not listening. So to avoid that, I would ask for participation. And another thing I would do is if I do want John to participate, then I would say something more along the lines of, John, I'm coming to you in a minute. So Claire's telling me about her weekend. Then I'm going to be asking Jack, and then John, have a think, because I will be asking you what about your weekend, which gives him a chance to copy the models of the others and to think of his answer. So that is how I would avoid cold calling. I'll talk about homework a little later, if that's okay. I've mentioned memory games and the challenges they can be. So you can help that by scaffolding. You can scaffold anything. Scaffolding could be putting the first letter. If you think about my Kim's game, I could have the number, how many objects there were. That would help. Then I could put the first letter, and then I could just do this after 3 minutes, give 5 minutes. So it's still a memory test for those that are comfortable with it. Then I could start drawing the objects so that at the end there's less memory work and more language recycling. For reading and listening comprehensions, what I would try and do is cut up the text and we always see when we do a reading comprehension, the first 3 questions are on the first paragraph, the second are on the second paragraph, etc. So I would simply cut up the paragraphs, make sure it's all spaced out, and put the questions in between each paragraph as you go through. So first of all, the student doesn't see a huge wad of text to read. They see a paragraph. All I have to read is that. Then I do the questions. Then I read. Then I do the questions. So that's less mentally taxing. And your reading comprehension is supposed to be, can the students find and understand the answer? Do they understand the text? It is not searching for the answer in a haystack. It's not searching a huge text, which is a challenge for anybody, I think. Okay, let me just note down, irregular, past. Yeah. Okay. Oral presentations can be a challenge to all of your students, including those who you think have writing difficulties or reading and writing difficulties. Okay, so I think it's important to remember that, to again scaffold. So that could be giving them the introduction, that could be giving them the first few words of each phrase. So we're going to be talking about dogs. Dogs are found. Dogs look like. Many dogs can, etc. Giving them the first line, that can be the first line, the first word, the first phrase of a paragraph, and letting the students have their notes. Another thing I found works well with a lot of my students is using mind maps to organize their thoughts, because their thoughts may not be in the linear plan that you would like to see a text or an oral presentation, because they may be thinking like that. So by using a mind map, you can fill in there, and there, and there. Okay. Practice testing diminishes stress on the day, lets them know what they're in for, practices what we're doing. And studies have shown that learning something and then testing it, we should basically be learning, 20% of our time should be learning, and the other 80% should be retesting that learning to make sure we know it. So make sure you have plenty of practice testing. That could be a little quiz, it could be a Kahoot, it could be write 5 words at the beginning of every lesson, or you could use exit tickets where you give out little questions and each student has to answer a question before they can leave the class. Okay, exit tickets are a brilliant idea. I love them. During the actual lesson, routines for what we're going to do, routines how I write on my whiteboard. This is very important. And write down your routines. Today we are going to start with this, then we are going to look at this, then we're going to do a listening, then we're going to do a reading, and try and stick to it. That will reassure your students. They will be able to see where they are. I've mentioned cold calling, and be open about SPLD. I'm always, I don't think we have a lesson where I don't mention that it's because of my ADHD, or probably my ADHD hasn't helped me in packing my bag this morning, or that when you talk about famous people, who do you admire, etc. One of the activities I do with my students is we look at fail. The lesson is fail, first attempt in learning. And I give them a whole list of people. There's Walt Disney, there's Elvis Presley, there's Michael Jordan. And I ask them what they've got in common. And one of the things they have in common is that they failed spectacularly at something. Michael Jordan has failed, I don't know how many of his shots that he's taken. Colonel Sanders, Kentucky Fried Chicken, love it or definitely don't love it. But when he started Kentucky Fried Chicken, he was about 70 years old, and he had been unemployed for many, many years. So looking at all these people, looking at all the difficulties they had, make it part of them. Robbie Williams is brilliant. And of course, don't forget, he had ADHD and dyslexia, I believe. So did many famous people. So mention it, be open and talk about it. There are many tech devices available. So the simplest ones are, if you take a photo with an iPad, sorry, that's what we use in our schools, or with an iPhone, you can then choose, you can copy the text and you can ask your phone or iPad to read the text to you. So this can really lighten the cognitive load for our students. Only today I was assisting a student with dyslexia who was doing a comprehension. And so she took a photo of the text and listened to the text before we started looking at the questions. Think carefully about what you're evaluating. If you're evaluating their comprehension, you're not evaluating the speed at which they read or how much they can read in half an hour. Okay. And finally, give them a break. Remember that for some people, and a lot of people, as I said earlier, we don't know what's going on the rest of the day. We don't know where they've come from, what's been happening. So make the class a positive place. And I remember somebody mentioned in the chat, and I have posters of this in my classroom. This is a place where mistakes happen, learning is messy, and we're in it together. My essential toolkit in my bag, if I do not forget it, I have Blue Tack or Patafix or whatever, which is brilliant. You can use it to play with if you want to concentrate on something. It doesn't make any noise when you drop it. It's not expensive. I also use it for some students to stick their papers on the table so they don't move when they're writing. It can help with that. Some of my students use folders so that they're writing on a slope. And again, I stick the texts on that if it helps them. Elastic bands. So two kinds of elastic bands. First of all, small ones to play with, as I've mentioned, and also big, thick ones. I'm just looking, and obviously I don't have any to hand. Like sports bands that you put around your legs can work really well if you put them around chairs, chair legs. They can help students sit on them, and it gives the students a chance to move a little bit in a way that's not going to disturb others in the classroom. A ring binder, as I mentioned, means that students can be working on a slope if it helps them. And with your whiteboard, I'm very careful that the pen is thick and you can write clearly. Again, avoid writing too much on the board. And when you wipe it off, make sure you wipe it off all of it and don't leave just the odd word or line, which for you might be perfectly obvious, but for them, it could be an accent or something like that. I mentioned extra pens, books, etc. If you can't keep them in your classroom, then I'm sorry, maybe you should carry them about a bit. And in this day and age, if you can put anything on the on an online platform, Google Classrooms or any other thing, or a class WhatsApp group, do. And take photos of the exercises in the books, make sure you've written the homework in 12 different places, write it on the board, let them take photos, etc. Okay. There's nothing more frustrating for a poor student than going home, wanting to do the homework and not being able to find where it is. So do make sure all that's quite clear. There we are. I am going to leave it there so that I have time to answer your questions. Let me just have a look. Right, yes, homework, forgotten homework. So again, it is a question of responsibility versus etc. So in my young learners and teens classroom, I have a joker policy. You have 2 jokers every month. And if you come and you've forgotten the homework, or you've forgotten the book, or you've not done the homework, it doesn't matter. Joker, please, Mrs. Harris. Great. Tick. Second time, another joker. After that, then I send a message home. But you can buy back jokers. If you go on the website, my website I use with my students, there are little activities and games. And so in your free time, you can go and do an activity, give it me, and then you get another joker. So although I give my students 2 jokers a term, some of them actually end the term with more, because they've just done these exercises. And some of them will find it easier to do the exercise than the homework, even though the exercise is often more work. But anyway, okay. And then at the end of term, I buy back the jokers and I exchange them for sweets. So if you've got your 2 jokers left, you can have 2 sweets. And then, of course, everyone gets a sweet anyway, because... so that's what I do with homework, and it's non-judgmental. It means that I don't have to tell you off because you've forgotten your homework again, because we all make mistakes, we all forget things. And if I forget something, the kids are the first ones to say, "Oh, that's a joker," which I then note in my book as well. Okay. So that's how and also it means it doesn't matter whether you've done the homework but not brought it, you've not done it, etc. If they've started it and not been able to finish, that's different. I want everyone to try, but we're not there to get the homework completely right. Otherwise, it was too easy. Okay. Another comment. Oh, yes, Varvara. Past simple and irregular verbs. Practice, practice, practice. Games, dominoes. Depending on the age of the students, I get them to practice things like we can play board running, get them moving a bit, put a line down the board, have 2 groups, and you call out go, and they have to run to the front and right went, and the first group that get it correctly, they can work together in their teams, stand, etc. Get them to write them on the front. Hangman, exit tickets. Yeah, but I mean, it's part of the learning, but it's also going to be harder with some of your students, Varvara. And yeah, I'm afraid there's not always a magic wand, or I would give it you. If possible, other examples to help elder secondary students like year 8, 13. I spend a long time talking to my students about learning strategies, about how you're going to organize your work and how are you going to do it. So for many reasons, helping them to break it down, because a lot of the reason students don't do the work or can't do the work or don't start the work is overwhelm. So break it down. This is what I want. I want an essay on school uniforms. So how are we going to break it down? First of all, think of your vocab of the uniform. Then think of this, then think of that, and give them little tasks to complete. And then, because I want it written and handed in on Monday, by Thursday, I want you to send me a screenshot of your notes. And if you want, I can help and answer questions. So scaffolding, support, checklists. You've got a test next week. What do you need to know? What do you need to bring? What do you not need to forget? Another thing that can help them is just a brain dump. Write down everything that you need to remember and that's in your brain. And then helping them find systems, whether this is going to be alarms on their phone, whether it's notes on their phone, what works for them. There's no point having a homework diary if it's going to be another little book for them to forget at home. But most teens don't forget their phone, I've noticed. So love it or hate it, yeah, work with it if you can, of course. I hope that gives some ideas. Also, the rubber bands. Okay, so, excuse me, 1 second. Yes, okay. So bands like this, you can buy on that terrible website that sells everything, or in sports shops, and you can put them on the legs of the chair. I don't have a chair at the front. And then it gives your student something to put their foot on, or you could put them around the table, maybe the table legs, depending. For certain students, it gives them something to put their feet on and allows them to have a bit more movement in the classroom. So I've got 5 or 6 of these, and I've also got some squidgy cushions that I bought, and I leave them in the cupboard and I leave them at the front, along with a lot of other things like coloured overlays, things like that. And what it means, so when you first bring them into class, everybody wants to play with them and everybody wants to use them. And you just have to get over that first 2 or 3 lessons. And then they're just there on a few chairs, etc. And the students that want them just go and take them. And all those that were queuing up for them at the beginning, most of them have gone off them. Okay, so just an idea to help movement, maybe more with younger students, but everybody enjoys it. Okay, time is up, but as Brigitte's going to mention, we do have another webinar coming up, which will be based on dyslexia. But if you do have any questions or anything that come up, keep it, and I'll probably be able to answer them next time as well. Okay, so wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining, and to you, Brigitte.
Yeah, thank you. Right, I just wanted to add, it's link number 3. There are 3 links here. The first 2 are to the books, Activities for Developing Learning Strategies and 50 Ways to Include Learners with Dyslexia. And link number 3 is to the webinar. So you can register there if you haven't done that yet. Right, I think you have answered all the questions. I can't see any. Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. Lovely webinar. Great listening to you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. And your students are thanking you for giving up your time for them. Don't forget that. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
See you soon, Rachel. Bye, everyone. Bye.